There's a fascinating scene at the end of the final episode of that great Netflix series, The House of Cards. And the scene is this, where Congressman Frank Underwood, a true atheist, visits a church. And he begins to talk to the God he doesn't believe in. And then he looks to the ground and talks to Satan. But finally, he settles by praying to himself. You see, he's a man without a soul. On the way out of the church, though, he lights a vigil candle. And then he extinguishes all the other vigil candles, and finally, also, he extinguishes the one that he lit. As I watched it, I thought perhaps, for a single second, he thought he might choose the light. But how quickly he settled for darkness. In our second reading today, Paul writes to the Ephesians, "Take no part in the fruitless works of darkness." And Jesus in the gospel gives sight to the blind man. House of Cards, if you're familiar with it, is only about darkness and blindness. Alessandra Stanley from the New York Times describes it as one of the most joyless shows on television. And if you've ever watched it, you know that it's all about greed and power and sex and murder and drugs and hatred. Frank and Claire Underwood, they're a team, and they seek power to dominate and control others. They believe that power is what fulfills us and makes us strong. And they blind themselves to any kind of morality. It's very interesting in TV these days that we have been presented as of late with so many characters very similar to Congressman Frank Underwood. We have Don Draper from Mad Men, a show about the American culture and society of the 60s, a show that highlights drinking and sexism and adultery and homophobia and anti-Semitism and racism. And Don Draper is a man who worships the image that he has created of himself. But basically, he is a lonely and broken man, scared that he's going to be found out, scared that his illusion will come crashing down in front of everyone. He's also blind to the reality around him and blind to any morality. Then, of course, there's Walter White from Breaking Bad, the story of the high school chemistry teacher who turns into a methamphetamine king. And people just seem to keep dying on that show. And very interestingly enough, Breaking Bad, the series Breaking Bad, has been considered one of the greatest television series of all time. The creator is a man by the name of Vince Gilligan, and he said it was difficult to write for Walter White because the character is so dark and so morally questionable. He wrote this, he said, "I'm going to miss the show when it's over, but on some level, it'll be a relief to not have Walt in my head anymore." Well, the saying goes, there's nothing new under the sun. These present-day TV characters are Shakespearean. They remind us of Richard III and Macbeth and their individualistic power grabbing that left them blind to the dignities of others, devoid of conscience, powerless, and dying friendless and alone. So there's a question, I think, for all of us in our culture today as we see these television series. Are these popular TV series, these modern Shakespearean dramas, a true picture of our culture today? Is our culture really filled with people blind to the dignity of others, filled with darkness and devoid of conscience? Is it simply all about power at any cost whatsoever? Well, hopefully not. Certainly, the church preaches something very different. And though we are tempted, all of us, to choose darkness, and we are often blinded by our own egos, we believe, the church believes, I believe our God believes, that there is a basic goodness in all of us that has to be cultivated. If you read the New York Times 2 weeks ago, March 16th, David Brooks wrote an op-ed that he entitled "The Deepest Self." And he writes about how our lives are based on all sorts of deep unconscious processes. He writes about the differences between our origins and what he calls depth. He wrote this, he said, "We originate with certain biological predispositions, but depth which is at the core of our being is something we cultivate over time. Our origins are natural. Our depths are man-made, engraved by thought and action." Now, we as Christians take that one step further, that our depth is also a result of our response, our openness to God's grace. You see, as a church, we believe that grace is available to each one of us to choose light over darkness. The darkness brings disorientation, and light brings focus. The disoriented self will always be anxious and fearful and troubled and uneasy. The focused self will always be centered, convicted, determined, and happy. Hence, performing deeds and acts of goodness and kindness and compassion and righteousness can only lead us to one place, and that's truth. And living in this truth, which is ultimately living in the truth of ourselves, will most certainly bring us pleasure. It'll bring us pleasure and an inner contentment and peace. Clearly, following Jesus means removing the blindness that prevents us from seeing the truth and acting in accord with the way that God has designed us. And as believers, we cannot have it both ways. While we struggle with moments of blindness and darkness, we cannot claim a belief in Jesus and remain so mired in a self-focused vision of ourselves and the world that we think that we can simply railroad over the needs and the desires of people in our pursuit of personal gain. This simply cannot be. It's not the Christian way. If we truly believe in the person of Christ, we're always struggling to remove our blindness. Now, indeed, the human mind seems wired for competition. But it's so interesting in the last number of years that neuroscientists have also demonstrated that the human mind gets as much pleasure from doing acts of charity as it does from acquiring prized possessions or status. The brain's reward center is even activated when we watch other people doing good things. So as we come together this fourth Sunday of Lent, the Lenten season calls you and me to cultivate the best part of ourselves. There's another fascinating scene from the House of Cards where Frank and Claire are reflecting and talking about the darkness in their lives. They're talking about their grasping, their climbing, their striving. And Claire looks at Frank and she says, "And then what will it all have been for?" They have a moment of facing truth. What will it all have been for? Shakespeare so often wrote of the corrosive psychological and political effects that are produced when evil is chosen as a way to fulfill the ambition for power. If you're familiar with Richard III, you know that he was alone and unrepentant on the battlefield. He's killed by Richmond. His ambitions come to nothing. Lady Macbeth commits suicide, and Macbeth, he's beheaded by his enemies. Paul reminds us, challenges us, take no part in the fruitless works of darkness. So the challenge of our Lenten season is for each of us to probe the deepest part of ourselves, where God is discovered, where mystery is discovered, where love is discovered, and bring all that is found in the deepest part of our lives into our world. Our task in this life is not to gain the most power or to be the one who dies with the most toys, but to live, to love, to be, simply for the sake of living and loving and being. And if not, then the question is, then what will all of this been for?